Hello and welcome to today's discussion session, or our review of our discussion session of the social principles of the United Methodist Church at Davison United Methodist Church. I'm Pastor Rob McPherson, and I'm glad that you have tuned in to take part in listening to the discussion, and invite you to respond if you'd like with any comments or questions that you may have. Today we moved into the section of the social principles called the political community. It is on page 32, and it's starting one of the new major sections. So each of the major sections of the social principles has a preface, and the political communities one is no different. In each of these prefaces, what usually happens is the writers have taken time to set up some of the principles that we're going to use to determine what God wants from us. And in this particular case, to set up some of the principles that God wants from us in our political lives. It opens with a quote from Wesley from one of his sermons called Circumcision of the Heart. It is this: "Love is the fulfilling of the law, the end of the commandment. Very excellent things are spoken of love. It is the essence, the spirit, the life of all virtue. It is not only the first and great command, but it is all the commandments in one. Whatever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are amiable or honorable, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, they are all comprised in this one word, love." So it seems perhaps a little unusual or different to begin our section on politics with a quote about love. What, to quote a great songwriter, what's love got to do with it? What's love got to do with our political community? And as we talked about that, we really thought it's such an aspirational idea, such a wonderful idea. The first paragraph of the preface gets into an explanation of how love works in politics, or should work in politics. It says our political systems should be rooted in the gospel imperative to love our neighbors, to do justice, and to care for the vulnerable. We acknowledge as United Methodists that love requires responsible political action and engagement aimed at the betterment of society and the promotion of the common good. Now, we may clearly have different opinions on what betters society and what is the common good. But if we could do that in love, love is the basis, we believe, of making those decisions. And some of the characteristics of love that we would hope begin to show forth in politics are humility, a mindfulness of our own complicity in perpetuating justice. That means aware that we have participated in doing things that are wrong, and perhaps asking for forgiveness of that. It also necessitates compassion, prayer, and a willingness to discern God's guidance. So all of that paragraph then is saying this is how love should be the basis for our politics. It should be seeking a betterment of society, promoting the common good. It should be humble, aware of our own failures. It should be compassionate and prayerful and discerning. This preface then moves to some other other principles that we build our positions on politics around. Again, it's reiterating some things we've heard in many of the other sections. This is not new stuff. We believe in the inherent worth of all people, established through God's gracious act of creation. We're created in God's image, it's going to say later, and fully revealed in Jesus' death and resurrection, his life, death, and resurrection for all of us. So all people are of worth. And that's a central action or central belief to how we shape our ideas of politics. And then because of that, because all people are of value, we believe that God calls all members of the human family to recognize that dignity and worth of people and to work for the well-being of all God's creation. So we add to that, not only has God created us in God's image, but God has also surrounded us in a creation that we are supposed to care for. And so that is the grounding principle of all of this. Then there's a little bit of a surprising line at the end of the preface, which some people may not like. In particular, we affirm the important work of the United Nations in promoting peace and security, championing human dignity and human rights, and advocating for sustainable development. As we talked about this, we talked about how we're here now talking about politics on a worldwide scale, right? We're not talking about on a national scale. We're talking about worldwide, as a worldwide church. And the United Nations is one of the only political entities that really strives to bring all nations together. It doesn't say that it supports all that the United Nations does. It specifically targets some things that the United Nations do, promoting peace and security, championing human dignity and human rights, and advocating for sustainable development. So again, calling on what is the political structure of the world to do the things that we believe are loving and honor and recognize the dignity of all human beings. So then we got into the fun and exciting stuff as we get into the specific areas. And the first one is church and government. And this has 5 sections, 5 paragraphs. If you look on page 32 and 33, you can see those paragraphs. The first paragraph has to do with the independence of church and government and their integrity and how they relate to each other, that they should be mutually respectful, but neither should seek to dominate or unduly influence the other. It doesn't mean they shouldn't try to influence each other, but not dominate or unduly. That religious communities and governments are separate entities and work together in a mutual relationship, but neither seeks to take over the other. The second paragraph is that reminds us that God judges not only individuals, but judges the nations, judges governments. And therefore, it's just a reminder of that and sets up some specific ways that God does that. The third paragraph sets up some aspirations for what people who are serving as leaders and stewards, people of authority, how they should act. That they should have the highest standards of professionalism, honesty, and integrity. We all really want that. That was what we decided as we sat around the table. We really want government officials who are professional and honest and integrous and don't always feel like we get that. But it's aspirational. It's what we hope for. It's what we'd love to see. And further, we urge governments, it says, to have accountable and transparent systems in place. In other words, so that people can be held accountable for wrong actions and that we can see what is happening in our government so that we can trust it. Aspirational, something we really hope can happen. The fourth paragraph is about things that we don't want the governments to be doing. Things like torture, killings, coercion to silence political opponents, slavery, war crimes, crimes of aggression, etc., etc. All those things that we don't want our governments to be doing. They're not loving. And finally, the fifth paragraph says that churches should avoid affiliating with specific political parties, but we do encourage churches to speak out boldly on social issues from a global perspective. I think that's so that we can maintain our prophetic voice. If we align ourselves with one party, then it's tempting to accept everything that party does and not be willing to critique. But if we step back from all political parties, again, worldwide, not just in the United States, we can be voices that say this is a godly thing, this is not a godly thing, and we can do that for all those who are in leadership, not just those that we have affiliated with. It also suggests that all churches have the responsibility to educate and equip their members to be advocates for justice in the wider world. We then began to talk about some of our experience of people in government versus church. We talked about a number of us have had family members who've been in politics, whether local or national or at the state level. We've talked about some people who got petitions going or were part of groups to hold officials accountable when felt like that wasn't happening. We've had some of us from our own church who've met with Michigan legislators about mental health situations. So a number of experiences of how church and government interact. All felt like there was definitely that sense of separation, but also that calling to hold people to a godly standard, or to act in ways and to promote things that were godly, so that there was that give and take. I think in a pretty positive way, most people's experiences were. We then went to scriptures that come to mind about the relationship between church and government. And as I expected, the very first one that came to mind was the render unto Caesar. It's Matthew 22, verses 15 through 22, where Jesus is asked about taxes. And he has them go get a coin and asks whose face is on it. Was definitely the first one that came to people's mind. The next one was about people weren't quite sure where it was, but the sense that God has placed government officials in authority for a reason. And that comes from Romans 13, 1 through 7. It is a passage in which Paul says that authority is given by God to government officials, and that we should subject ourselves to that authority because government punishes those who have broken the law and doesn't punish those who are good. It's helpful to remind oneself that Paul was a Roman citizen, and he was speaking in a time perhaps where he was worried that by breaking the law, the Romans would come and crush the early Christian movement. But we also know that there are times when governments are not. His statement's very aspirational, assuming that governments are going to uphold the law and going to be good and only punish those who deserve it. And we know from history that's not always the case. So we read that passage as one that's aspirational, one that says, when government is operating well, place yourself under its authority, listen to it. We're going to come to that a little bit later when we get to civil disobedience. So those were the two that really came up for people as they were thinking about things. People then began to think about Jesus himself and his crucifixion, and that doesn't really necessarily say a lot about the relationship between church and government and religious leaders as it should be, but there's interesting interplay in that whole trial session with Jesus, where he's first before the religious leaders, and then they pass him to the political leaders. The political leaders try to pass him back to the religious leaders. There's definitely that interplay between the two. I don't know if it teaches us anything about what government and how religion and government should interact, but it's certainly interesting to watch as it happens. Let's see. So then we got to some that maybe people weren't aware of. There's a lot of relationship between prophets and kings throughout the Old Testament. In fact, in 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 through 21, Samuel is trying to persuade the people that they don't want a king. For whatever reason, all the lands around them have kings. The Israelites now, well, we want a king. And Samuel's trying to talk them out of it. And he feels a little offended and hurt that they are rejecting his leadership and want a king instead. And God tells him, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And then tells Samuel some of the evils that kings will do. That they'll take the sons and put them to war and they'll die. They'll take the daughters and use them as wives and concubines for themselves. That they're going to tax them. Kind of talking about all the reasons you really don't want a king. But since you really want one, we'll give you one. And then the prophets and the kings are continually at odds. There is this interplay between the religious critiques of the leadership and the leadership's sometimes killing of the religious people, sometimes encouraging of them, but that the two interact as sort of point and counterpoints to each other. We could look at Exodus as an example of how government and religious leaders interact. Perhaps my favorite of all the passages that talk about the interrelationship between us as religious people and leaders is in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. In it, we are encouraged to pray for those who are in authority, that we may live a peaceful, quiet, godly, and dignified life. I like that because it doesn't matter who the religious leader is, that I can pray for them that they would lead in a way that helps us to have peaceful, quiet, godly, and dignified lives. I don't have to like the leader. I don't have to agree with the leader, but I can pray for them that they would be that kind of leader. And that is one of those ways that helps us to move beyond perhaps the political parties, but to pray for them in a way that leads us to what would be a better life for all of us. I think that's enough in that section for now. Let's go to civil disobedience. So the section on civil disobedience, this is caption B, says, we support those who, acting under the constraints of moral conscience or religious conviction, and having exhausted all other legal avenues, feel compelled to disobey or protest unjust or immoral laws. And that it encourages that to happen peacefully. And then it appeals to governments to respond to those demonstrations peacefully, protecting public safety, but preventing emotional and bodily harm to those engaged in the civil disobedience. It's a statement that is hoping that when we need to make changes to laws, that can be done in a peaceful way, both on the sides of those who are demonstrating and in those who are on the sides of law enforcement. Now, we know that doesn't always happen. We can look around the world. We can look at our own country's history. We can see times when demonstrations became riots or became violent. We can see times when those in authority responded with violence and didn't respond with ways that were peaceful. We can see ways that this has crossed the boundary both ways. But the hope is, the belief is, that it would be best if this can be done in ways that are nonviolent, that are respectful of dignity, and remind us that all people are of sacred worth. It goes back to those initial principles again, right, of what we were talking about in terms of politics. as we talked about the experiences of civil disobedience, we had a very non-disobedient group. None of our members had participated in any particular forms of civil disobedience, but many had family members and memories, deep memories of times of demonstration. Everything from memories of Detroit riots, of Kent State, of the Vietnam demonstrations, of bra burning, of demonstrations about abortion, family members who have taken carloads of people to various demonstrations. So although our particular group was not involved in those particular things, certainly a number of people that we have interacted with have been. We then talked about biblical examples that came to mind, and the first one that came to people's mind was right after Jesus is arrested and killed and rises again. They know that they were told to stop, the disciples were told to stop preaching, and they say they can't do that. That is indeed an example of civil disobedience. They've been told and instructed to do one thing, but they can't do that. They're unable to do that. People had a hard time coming up with these particular passages, which is interesting because there are so many of them. So I kind of had to do some prompting here. So we went to Exodus and the midwives who refused to kill the children because the women have given birth too quickly, right? That's not true, of course. The women still needed help from the midwives, but they're peacefully disobeying the Pharaoh's order to kill the children. Moses himself, in his meetings with the Pharaoh, is continually critiquing and asking for a change in laws and protesting that they should be able to worship and eventually to be set free. Another major book that talks about civil disobedience is the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 3, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refuse to bow down to the golden statue and therefore are thrown into the fiery furnace. We have Daniel himself, who the law has been made that no one should pray to anyone except for the king. And Daniel goes to his room in quiet and he prays anyway. That's Daniel 6. And he's thrown into the lion's den. These are examples of civil disobedience. These are laws that they felt were unjust or immoral, that they could not follow. And so they broke them. Once I kind of primed that, people started thinking about Esther. Esther is another. The book of Esther is, in a sense, a book of civil disobedience. We've got Haman, a man who dislikes the Jews and kind of comes up with this law saying that all the Jews should be killed. And Esther, against both law and custom, steps in and before the king and appeals to him to remove this law. Tells what has happened. It is an act of civil disobedience, perhaps a calm and quiet one, and yet it is still an act of bravery on her part in doing what she can. Let's see, what else have we got? So then we talked about the whole history of Rome and Christianity. There are undertones throughout the New Testament of that conflict between Christians and Rome. And that has a history. And it's a history that is developing after Jesus has died, and you're beginning to see it, obviously, in his crucifixion by the Roman authorities. And it's been around for a while. There have been some conflicts between Rome and the Jews. But it's going to it's going to move to an even stronger state. And that's happening as the biblical texts are being written. And so there's this undertone that's there. Let me give you a bit of the history. In 40 CE, or some of you may think of it as 40 AD, after Christ, after his birth, there comes a time when Caligula, the Roman emperor, attempts to have his statue placed in the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, knowing how strongly Christians and Jews are against idolatry, you would know that that would be something that was absolutely unacceptable. And the people of Israel throw an absolute fit and do manage to prevent that happening. But then there's a little later an attempt by Rome to collect funds from the temple. They are already taxing the individuals. Now they want to tax the temple too. And these repeated offenses against the temple by the Roman authorities lead to a rebellion in 68 CE. And Rome does not respond passively or peacefully. Rome crushes that rebellion. They crush all resistance. It takes until 70 AD, 70 CE for it to happen. The historians from the time, Josephus or others, that write about what happened, the estimates are that between 600,000 and 1.1 million people are killed in Jerusalem by the Romans and 97,000 enslaved. Now, to put that into perspective, Jerusalem only had about 1 million residents at the time. But it was Passover when the Romans came in. So the crowds of people throughout Israel had gathered for the celebration of this holy time. And the Romans come in and kill 600,000 to 1.1 million people, and 97,000 are taken as slaves. That event, that series of events, starting with the attempt at to have the statue placed in the temple, through that crushing of the rebellion, has ripples and influences into the New Testament texts as they're written. So you're going to hear Jesus talk about the destruction of the temple as he talks about his resurrection. And people are going to rehear that differently later on as they see the temple destroyed. You're going to have people talking about the day of the Lord, when women will run and pregnant women will be in dismay. You're going to hear about in Revelation the placing of that which is unholy in the holy. You're going to get all of these glimpses of the conflict between Rome and the Jews and the Christians. And in it all, there is this sense of civil disobedience, of not buying into the need to worship the emperor. We're not going to do that. No matter what the government says, we are not going to do that. We will not participate in that. And that is a sense of civil disobedience that's very subtle in places throughout, but also stronger in other places. So one of the places that my seminary professors pointed out as a civil disobedience toward Rome that Jesus teaches is in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:38 to 42. Jesus says to turn the other cheek, to if someone asks for your coat, to give them your shirt, and if you're forced to go 1 mile, to go 2 miles. And most people tend to hear that passage as, well, just let people do whatever. But my professor pointed out that there are Roman laws for Roman soldiers and what they could do to a person in an occupied territory legally and what was not legal. So they could strike a person, but if the person did not react violently, they could not strike them again. They could take a person's coat, but they could not take all their clothes. So if they asked for your coat because they were cold, and you gave them your shirt too, you were, in a sense, forcing them to break their own law. Same thing by turning the cheek. If they struck you again, they'd be breaking their own Roman law. And the soldiers could conscript someone to carry something for a mile, but only a mile. And Jesus is suggesting to go 2. So my professor was very convinced that Jesus was talking about using the Roman law against them to show them when they were being unjust and were persecuting people, to remind those who were in power that they were abusing their power. It kind of changes how we hear that passage, and it becomes much more a passage about less rolling over and more taking it upon yourself to show the wrongs that are happening. I don't know how you respond to that particular interpretation of those words, but that was one that he was very convinced of, and I think it makes me rethink that passage too in powerful ways. So civil disobedience. In times when there are unjust and immoral laws, certainly throughout the biblical example, we see many times when people do that. The challenge becomes, and this is kind of the parting words that I left our group with, is how do you decide if a law is unjust and immoral? And when you have exhausted all legal avenues, how do you disobey or protest that unjust or immoral law non-violently and with respect, but in a way that perhaps points out to those in authority that there is something wrong, that there is something not right? And I can't answer that question for you. We each have to answer that question for ourselves as we look at how we interact with the governments that we are that are over us in authority, and how we interact with those laws and those things that we encounter on a daily basis. So thank you for paying attention, listening to this section on government and civil disobedience. And may you have yourselves a wonderful and blessed day. Next week, we will be talking about restorative justice, the death penalty, and criminal justice.